of the great scholars, Wolf Peter Funk, Canada, Nag Hammadi scholar, stood up and said, I'm dissatisfied. You have not presented us with any photographs. And he was quite angry. And I think his he felt that if Dr. King were going to present so seemingly earth-shattering a discovery in front of her peers, she owed them a photograph in that initial presentation. Now, every single phrase, essentially, in the Gospel of Jesus' wife could be found in the Gospel of Thomas, except for two words, my wife.
You wrote in one section in your book, put crudely, the Da Vinci Code's Mary was a womb without a brain, while the Gospel of Mary was a brain without a womb. I think if you talk to a lot of scholars, they would argue that there's a very, very strong circumstantial case that there's only one person who had the skills, the time, the motivation, and the opportunity to forge it, and that's Walter Fritz. Ariel, I'd like to start by, again, I said I really enjoyed this book, and this book is more about forgery. It really has everything. I would like to call it a thriller because it's got espionage, exotic lands, the Catholic Church, ancient history. It's got everything. It could be made into a Hollywood movie, but all I think it needs is a chase scene. And even then, I think Hollywood could just have like Matt Damon playing you, just doing one chase scene, and we'd have a great movie. So it's an incredible read. Did you think this story would end up like it did?
Not at all. I mean, this is a story that initially really just fell into my lap. I was a relatively new freelance journalist for Smithsonian Magazine back in 2012, and got a cold call from an editor there who I'd never spoken to before. I had filed exactly one other story for Smithsonian Magazine, hadn't even been published yet. Top editor calls me and says, listen, Ariel, we've got advance word that in about 3 weeks, a very prominent professor at the Harvad Divinity School, Dr. King, world-renowned scholar, history of early Christianity, the sort of non-canonical Gospels, or the Gnostic Gospels, as they're sometimes called. And she has made this discovery. She has found a scrap of papyrus about the size of a business card with 8 lines of Coptic on it, one of which says, Jesus said to them, my wife. And in her opinion, this is the first ancient manuscript in which Jesus utters the words, my wife. So, I'm thinking like, I didn't know what was going on because I've written certainly about religion. My father actually, and this is my first book. My father is a native speaker of Aramaic, which is said to be the language of Jesus. He's a professor at UCLA in Near Eastern languages. I'd written a little bit about early Christianity. I myself happen to be Jewish, but certainly the Gnostic Gospels, the non-canonical Gospels, were not anything I'd written about before. But when the editor said, look, it's going to be an exciting story, we'd like you to basically drop everything, catch the next plane out to Harvard, interview Dr. King, and then essentially accompany her to Rome in a couple more weeks when she is going to announce this discovery at a scholarly conference, really just across the street from the Vatican.
And when you walked into this story, you must have been blown away because, as you write, from a scholarly conference, it didn't end up being like a festival, a great, intense, you might say, party or reaction from the crowd, like from the get-go.
Yeah, it was really interesting because, again, I'd certainly done in the course of 3 very, very intense weeks with very little sleep. I researched and then wrote a 6,000-word story for Smithsonian Magazine, whose publication coincided with Dr. King's announcement in Rome. I was the only journalist in the room when she announced this discovery, and I tape recorded it. And I remember being really interested in how the top people in her field would respond. And I suspect your listeners already know this, but Coptic is the language of Egypt's earliest Christians. It's the language in which Many of the oldest surviving copies of both the canonical and non-canonical Gospels are preserved. And so you've got the top people in the world in this field. They meet once every 4 years. There just simply aren't enough of them to justify an annual meeting, so they have quadrennial meetings. So it's a pretty big deal. And she makes her presentation, and almost immediately there are a lot of questions. And the interesting thing is that the questions at that point don't so much concern authenticity or forgery. They concern simply Dr. King's interpretation of the text. And you have to remember that this is a fragment. So that means it's missing its top margin, its bottom margin, its left margin, and its right margin. So while there are 8 very short lines on the front, the lines are missing both their beginnings and their ends. So we don't really know what words appear before each surviving line of text or after each surviving line of text. So there's kind of a lot of room for interpretation. And I remember right away that scholars were kind of questioning whether the fragment said what Dr. King thought it said. And that was sort of the initial sort of heated reaction. Then the other, I guess, the other sort of uproar in the room. And, if you've spent any time with scholars, they tend to, in person at least, be very civil to one another. They may detest one another in private, I suppose. But, in general, they tend to be civil to one another. So one of the great scholars, Wolf Peter Funk, Canada, Nag Hammadi scholar, stood up and said, I'm dissatisfied. You have not presented us with any photographs. And he was quite angry. And I think he felt that if Dr. King were going to present so seemingly earth-shattering a discovery in front of her peers, she owed them a photograph in that initial presentation. Now, Dr. King had told me that her laptop had broken on her flight from Boston to Rome, and I have no reason to doubt that. But three days had passed between that plane ride to Rome and her presentation. And Harvard had many of these images already uploaded, ready to post online. It seemed sort of strange to me that Harvard could not have emailed her those photos, or that Dr. King's colleague who was in the room, Anne-Marie Leyendyke of Princeton, a papyrologist, former student of King's, who also had the photographs on her laptop, could not have shared them with Dr. King to use in that presentation. And the reason those photos are important is that, typically before one launches into interpretation of a text, one has to decide whether the manuscript is in fact authentic. And the way in which Coptic scholars and papyrologists make that determination is by visual cues. So they need to see what the ink looks like. They need to see what the handwriting looks like. They need to see what the papyrus material looks like. And without any photographs in the room, that made it very difficult and I think frustrating for a lot of her colleagues on that September day in 2012 when she announces the gospel of Jesus' wife to colleagues.
How long did you follow this story after the conference?
Yeah, so, it was interesting. I got this initial assignment from Smithsonian. So sort of part one of that story was a feature, 6,000-word feature that posted essentially the instant that Dr. King announced her discovery in Rome. It had basically been pre-written based on my interviews with Dr. King, with Dr. Anne-Marie Leyendyke, and with Dr. Roger Bagnall, a world-renowned papyrologist at NYU at the time. And so I had the first story. So did the New York Times, and so did the Boston Globe. We'd all been granted early access to Dr. King, although I was the only one that went to Rome. And then about a week after that, I refined and revised that first story to kind of weave in the reaction from Rome, weave in what journalists call color, to kind of put people in the room in Rome as this is all going down. To solicit, I solicited reaction from really important figures in the field like Elaine Pagels, and wrapped that all together for another story, this one that did not appear online, but actually appeared in the print hard copy November 2012 issue of Smithsonian Magazine. So that was really, frankly, where I had left it for about 3 years. As I said at the outset, I'm a freelance journalist. I go where the assignments take me. I had filed this story. It was a whirlwind sort of assignment. It was really interesting and fascinating for all kinds of reasons. But I then had to move on to other stories for other magazines and didn't really think about it again until November of 2015.
As you mentioned, from the beginning, even in 2012, again, you went to this conference in Rome in September of 2012. Soon after, people knew that the lines were directly from the Gospel of Thomas, right? That was a big red flag from the beginning.
Yeah, that was one of the earliest finds, and it actually wound up, sometimes early takes are bad takes. A lot of people think they know what's going on, like right at the beginning, and they haven't really done their homework. But one of the discoveries made very early on, first to give him proper credit, by Dr. Francis Watson at Durham University in the UK. He was looking at this thing, and he's like, wow, that the line break on line 1 it matches the line break in the surviving Coptic copy of the Gospel of Thomas, which is already kind of interesting because typically line breaks don't match. And then he's looking at all the words, and he's realizing that that you could basically create the Gospel of Jesus' wife by cherry picking phrases from the Gospel of Thomas, and then reordering them so that you effectively are saying something new that sounds like something old. I forget who first put this metaphor out there, but some writer was saying that it was almost like, you've seen these ransom notes in the movies where the ransom note is built up of words that are cut from different magazines and different fonts. This was sort of a version of that. And what Dr. Watson concluded relatively early on, within a matter of 3 or 4 days, was that you could reconstitute, or you could constitute the Gospel of Jesus' wife by cutting and pasting phrases from the Gospel of Thomas. And every single phrase, essentially, in the Gospel of Jesus' wife could be found in the Gospel of Thomas, except for 2 words, my wife. And so that was an early breakthrough. It was poo-pooed by some of Dr. King's supporters early on, but it wound up being a really important one as people started investigating that theory more closely. And I think you'd mentioned him a little bit before we came on the air, but ultimately what scholars would discover was that not only did this trace to sort of the Coptic Gospel of Thomas, but it traced to a particular online transcript of the Gospel of Thomas that contained errors in Coptic because the individual who transcribed it made a mistake here and there. And one of the sort of smoking guns was when this eccentric typographical error made by Mike Grondin, who may be familiar to some of your listeners as the host of a very influential Gospel of Thomas website. He made a small error in one of his PDFs, but it's a PDF that a lot of people like to download. And oddly, that error, that typographical error in a 2002 PDF of the Gospel of Thomas winds up in what's supposed to be ancient handwriting in the Gospel of Jesus' wife. And we could talk about that more later, but that was an important breakthrough in the path that led to scholars deciding that this was a fake.
Yes, indeed. And what were some of the mistakes that Karen King made from the get-go? I think you spend a lot of time with them, but what do you say, maybe bullet points of, how things went from suspicious to bad quickly?
And I don't want to give away too many spoilers because a lot of them are in the final chapter of the book, but I'll certainly be happy to talk about some. I think it was clear even to scholars at the beginning that this was somewhat of a rush job, in the sense that, she did consult her former student. She did consult Roger Bagnall before going public, but she never consulted a top scholar of Coptic religious papyri, even though Dr. Bagnall had recommended she do so. One of the things that happened when she had submitted her article on the papyrus to the Harvard Theological Review. The Harvard Theological Review is one of the most important theological journals in the world. It's been around for a century. It's edited by the Harvard Divinity School. And she submitted her article to them before she went public with the papyrus. And, they do what any good journal does, which is send an article out for peer review. So you're basically taking an article and sending it to the top people in the field around the world. And the Harvard Theological Review doesn't mess around. And 2 out of the 3 reviewers, 2 out of the 3 anonymous double-blind peer reviewers came back and said, oh boy, this thing looks really bad. This looks like a forgery, and you will be embarrassing yourself if you publish it. And they identified lots of problems, including the apparent cribbing from the Gospel of Thomas, like something like 4 basic violations of Coptic grammar within the span of 8 lines, really bizarre, unprecedented handwriting, ink that didn't look right, ink that looked like it was applied by a brush rather than a reed pen, which would have been very anachronistic. And so already you have really important people in the field, although nobody knows who they are at the time. I will figure out who they are, and I disclose who they are in the book. But they're like the top people in the field in like the study of Nag Hammadi text, Nag Hammadi papyri. Like you almost couldn't do better. And they come back and they're like, "Don't do it. This is bad. This will not turn out well for anybody." But in spite of that, Dr. King is able to overcome these objections. Certainly in her mind. The Harvard Theological Review had not committed to publishing it at that point because of these concerns, but she felt confident enough to go forward and present this in Rome. And I think in retrospect, I think probably even she would acknowledge that was probably a mistake. Oh, and the other obvious oversight was she had conducted no scientific testing. That was not done here. In this case, there was no science. There was no expertise from the people in Coptic who actually deal with these ancient fragments of the Nag Hammadi Gospels. And so there was kind of a rush to go public, and that would be second guessed afterwards, particularly since the rush seemed to be to make the announcement across the street from the Vatican. I mean, Dr. King does not lack for opportunities to showcase her scholarship. It literally, I think 2 months after the Coptic conference in Rome, she could have delivered her discovery to an even bigger audience at the Society of Biblical Literature, I think, which was being held in Chicago that year. I mean, there's multiple conferences where she could have unveiled this, but there was a seeming rush to go public at this particular conference, which happened to be, she said it was just by chance, happened to be across from, St. Peter's Basilica and the Vatican.
For the audience, Ariel's book has so much more in it. It's quite a labyrinth that goes to so many places. But I guess this, of course, begs the question, and I see your book as a story of 2 individuals, Karen King and someone else we will get into. And so I see the story of projection, unresolved childhood trauma, and agenda. Because people may ask, how could somebody like Karen King, who's so driven, who broke so many glass ceilings, who a very rational, straight-laced person, go down this road? And you put very well, Ariel, which jumped out to me. You wrote in one section in your book, put crudely, the Da Vinci Code's Mary was a womb without a brain, while the Gospel of Mary was a brain without a womb. The gospel of Jesus' wife was the answer Karen King had looked for all of her life. I think, to me, that summarizes it, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of, again, admittedly put somewhat crudely there, but, Dr. King is an absolutely brilliant scholar who's done a lot of wonderful work. And as you said, has broken many glass ceilings, done very important scholarship. And I guess the thing that, fascinated me is why did this slip through? She's a very canny person. She's tough. She's a skeptic. She's built a career skewering the fictions of the church. She's not someone who's particularly gullible. And so what always fascinated me here is, how does this particular exception get through all those filters? And it's amazing how efficient these 9 lines of Coptic, or these 8 lines of Coptic are, because actually all you need is 2 of these lines to resolve this conundrum that Dr. King had identified. And it's the 4th and 5th lines. I mean, in retrospect, it's probably no coincidence that in what's supposed to be a random fragment of papyrus torn from the middle of a larger page, the most important and catchy lines are dead center. It's like someone was using Photoshop to force justify this thing, so that the most important lines were right in the middle. Jesus said to them, "My wife, ... she is able to be my disciple." So now you have Mary Magdalene as wife, as a presumably sexual person, who has a husband, and she's able to be my disciple. So she is able to teach, she is able to lead, and she's able to be, fully comfortable in her own flesh as a woman. And so it really kind of pushed all the buttons in a really disturbing way, in the sense that, now that we know that this is a forgery, that the forger or the con artist who presented this to Dr. King would have so cruelly kind of profiled her to identify, to know exactly where, like, sort of the Achilles heel is. And it makes me a little sad, to think that someone would go to such lengths to try to, do something like this. Although I think in his mind, in the con artist's mind, it was a win-win. I think he had his own reasons for wanting to launch this version of Mary Magdalene and this version of Jesus into the public consciousness.
Well said, Ariel. And it's ironic. Karen King, as you write, a loner, rejecting traditional history, going against the power of the Catholic Church. Yes, it's ironic. She was a Gnostic, even if she wanted to get rid of the term Gnosticism. But that's what's great about your book. There's so many ways to see it. And so now let's get, please, to how you come into the story. You came back to write on this article, and was your idea, I need to find the source of this gospel, who wrote it or who sold it to her?
Yeah, no, exactly. One of the things that really stuck with me from that first story I wrote for Smithsonian in 2012 was this question of who is this individual who gave Dr. King, or who approached Dr. King with this papyrus. And, Dr. King, I pressed her for this information back in 2012 because I was really curious, as were many of her colleagues. And she said, I can't tell you. I can't tell you who he is. He asked for anonymity. I am going to honor that request. And I really just can't tell you who he is. Now, this isn't all that uncommon. There are many private collectors who don't want to be identified. They're not particularly interested in the spotlight. They don't mind getting a little help from a professor. They don't mind even publicity coming to their manuscript, because obviously if a Harvard professor takes an interest in something you own, that can, make certainly boost its value, its market value quite a bit. But she wouldn't tell anybody who this guy was. And as a journalist, we're always taught to ask questions of who our sources are. It's like sort of like the first thing you learn in journalism school. I imagine one of the first things you learn as a student of history is evidence is important, but so are sources. And so in this case, who is the source? I start thinking again about this just mind-bending story I'd written 3 years before for Smithsonian, and like, whatever happened to the Gospel of Jesus' wife? And I start using this very sophisticated investigative tool, Google.com, and I find that there've been some, peer-reviewed articles written for and against authenticity. Dr. King sort of continuing to argue based on some scientific testing she had finally done after the fact that it was likely authentic. She didn't rule out the possibility of forgery, but felt it was likely authentic. And then you had an entire issue of New Testament Studies, another very prominent journal devoted to articles by top scholars arguing that this was a fake. So it seemed to be at something of a standstill, though by 2015, the majority of scholars were in the camp that this was a fake. But people were still at loggerheads. And so I'm thinking, is there anything I can do as a journalist? I'm not a scholar of Gnosticism. I don't read Coptic. I have nothing to contribute on that front. But I am good at asking questions, knocking on doors, using public records. And so, one of the nice things that Dr. King did in 2012 is that I said, look, I realize you can't tell me who this individual is, but I'd really like to be able to sort of show the public kind of the dance between complete stranger collector and scholar that leads to the publication of this thing. Is there any way you can share with me some of the text from his emails? So she very graciously did that. She gave me the text from the emails. She took out all the identifying information, no names, no email addresses, no locations. But there were enough little clues in those emails, I realized 3 years later, to give me a kind of thread that I could pull to start to figure out who the owner might be. And that leads on this just absolutely wild adventure that will take me all the way from, retirement communities of Florida through the sort of dark corners of the internet to internet pornography that the collector is a proprietor of, starring his own wife, to the former headquarters of the East German Stasi. And if you want me to weigh in on some of that, I can. Just let me know where to start. But it's a really wild story.
It's so fascinating. And you wrote the Atlantic story that basically broke this open. I remember scholars emailing me like, oh my God. And they were all focused on the porn thing for some reason. I was just focused on, oh my God, this is an incredible article. Was there a sort of, for you, Ariel, a Milli Vanilli moment when you said, aha, I know this is a forgery?
I tried to really keep an open mind. I actually did not have a position on whether it was a forgery when I set out to investigate provenance for the Atlantic magazine in 2016 or 2015. I really just wanted to know who the owner was and what knowing about who the owner was would tell us about the Gospel of Jesus' wife and the question of forgery. And, one of the, there were different places and times when all the puzzle pieces started to feel like they were coming together. One of the breaks was, Dr. King did not tell the world who the current owner was, but she did tell the world who the current owner told her was the owner before that, a gentleman by the name of H.U. Laukamp, Hans Ulrich Laukamp. Not a very common name. And I did, I sort of used some databases, discovered that there had only ever been a single Hans Ulrich Laukamp who had ever lived in the United States. He lived in this retirement community in Florida. He had died a few years earlier. So I couldn't very well interview him just to see whether he had owned it. But I started interviewing people who knew him. And they all told me, like, this guy never collected papyri. He had an 8th grade education. He wasn't interested. He didn't collect anything. That wasn't his interest at all. So already, like, the provenance story starts to develop this sort of glaring hole, which is that the individual that the anonymous collector said he bought the papyrus from wasn't actually a collector, didn't actually have papyri. And then I began putting that individual, so I would eventually discover, and I can mention his name here because I've mentioned it elsewhere, but the owner would turn out to be a gentleman named Walter Fritz. He's a German immigrant, and who's living in Florida. And in Googling the name Walter Fritz, it comes up with a lot of different names. There are a lot of different Walter Fritzes in the world, hundreds of them in Germany, even like 9 or 10 in Florida. But one of the Google results that comes up is that there is a 1991 article that's been written for a prestigious Egyptology journal in Germany by a Walter Fritz. And, I'm like thinking there's no way this guy in Florida who's an auto parts executive could be the same person who 20 years earlier wrote an article about the Amarna tablet, which is one of these ancient tablets between the Egyptian kings and the outlying provinces. It could just be just too fantastical to think that they're possibly related. And then I discovered in sort of looking in Florida public records that this Walter Fritz living in Florida owns this sort of mysterious business called Nefer art. And, I don't speak Egyptian, but I did. Nefer to me sounded like an Egyptian word.
Bells are going off. Yeah.
Bells are going off like Nefertiti. I'm like, wait a second. So there's someone related to this guy who allegedly formerly owned the papyrus, but in fact didn't own it, who is involved in some kind of Egypt-related business, and whose name matches the name of someone who wrote an article in Germany about Egyptology, sort of deciphering this ancient text 20 years earlier. And so when I first called Walter Fritz in Florida, he denies everything. I didn't know. I'm not the owner of the Gospel of Jesus' wife. I never studied Egyptology. You've got the wrong guy. You're barking up the wrong tree. He basically hangs up on me. And I have to thank the Atlantic magazine here. They were willing to send me to Germany to sort of figure out whether there was any connection between this Florida Fritz and the guy who'd apparently written this article. And sure enough, when I go to Germany and I start showing people the photograph of the Florida Fritz, which I got from a local Florida newspaper, they're like, yeah, looks kind of like a guy who studied Egyptology at the Free University in Berlin, but washed out of the program. He never finished it. He just disappeared one day, just vanished into thin air. No one ever knew what happened to him. This is the first, one person said, oh, I thought he was dead. Is he still alive? And so this Walter Fritz turns out to be the same guy who studied Egyptology in Berlin decades before. And to me, that's when some of those bells start ringing, where you're like, wait a second, what's going on here? And that's even before I realized that he is into this. He and his wife are very successful internet pornographers. And not only that, but she also has self-published a book, Spiritual Evolution, Universal Truths, Volume 1, in which she claims to channel the voices of angels and the voices of God and the Archangel Michael, and via automatic writing, so that she sits down and she has clear audience, I think she calls it, where there's no medium involved. She can just hear the voices of angels, and then she can sort of instantly transcribe what they're saying, their wisdom, into a word processor. And then she published some of this. Now, one of the things I found fascinating is that the book she publishes of this automatic writing, all of the entries of all the diary-like entries in this book coincide with the period in which her husband, Walter Fritz, is courting Dr. King. To me, it's just sort of brilliance to it that I hope readers have find illuminating when they try to wrestle with what exactly is this couple up to when they approach Karen King with this sensational papyrus.
Yeah, it's almost like it was some sort of Greek tragedy that Walter and Karen King were going to meet. You write the parallels to their lives, their desires. They're very connected, at least so Walter could have seen a sort of a twin in Karen King for various reasons.
Yeah, that was another big breakthrough, because, after he had lied to me and said, I don't know what you're talking about, I'm not the owner, I don't know anything about this. Again, using the very sophisticated forensic tool, google.com, I started putting in variations of Walter Fritz's email address, different ways of configuring the address, and after about an hour of doing that, up popped a website that tracks the history of domain name registration. So when you register a domain name, which is a fancy way of saying whatever follows www in a web address, there's a registrar that records all of that. And so what I discovered was that someone using Walter Fritz's email address, presumably Walter Fritz himself, had registered the domain name www.gospelofjesuswife.com. So this was an individual who had his email address and was using the same physical address where Walter Fritz lives. And I'm like, well, that's interesting. Like, is he a guy who kind of took an interest in the Gospel of Jesus' Wife after Karen King announced it to the world? So I go back and look at the date of the domain registration, and it's 3 weeks before Karen King goes public. And, that's at a point where only a very, very small group of people are privy to this coming announcement and her name for the papyrus. So that made it very, very clear that Walter Fritz had lied to me, number one, in our first conversation. And number two, that he was very, very intimately connected with the papyrus. And that was one of those, falling out of your chair moments for me as well.
Oh, I bet it must have been incredible. And he never really admitted it. Guess he wanted you to write a novel about Mary Magdalene with him, but he never really admitted it in the end, did he?
No, we have to give Walter his due here. I'm a big believer in journalistic fairness. I'll be very clear with all of your listeners. Walter Fritz continues to deny having forged the Gospel of Jesus' Wife. So that's his position. I think if you talk to a lot of scholars, they would argue that there's a very, very strong circumstantial case that there's only one person who had the skills, the time, the motivation, and the opportunity to forge it, and that's Walter Fritz. And I should also say that one of the big discoveries in the book too, which I think makes it a lot harder for Walter to maintain his position, that he would never ever do something like this. Using public records again in Florida, I discovered that while applying for jobs with the Sarasota County, Florida schools, Walter Fritz submitted a forged Egyptology diploma, master's diploma from the Free University, the very school where he and all of his professors, he'll tell you himself, he never graduated from. But for purposes of a job application, he submitted a forged Free University Egyptology diploma in his own name, basically using the same MO that every scholar thinks he used in both the Gospel of Jesus' wife and the fake provenance documents, which he supplied Dr. King to convince her of that it had authentic provenance. It's a cut and paste. It's the same MO every single time. You take a pre-existing document, you put some new text on top of it, and then you Xerox it, and there's no original. So for the fake Egyptology diploma that he submitted to the Sarasota County Schools, it's actually, if you look at the names of the professors at the bottom, the professors didn't teach in Egyptology at all. They taught in the Department of Eastern European History, completely unrelated department. Walter Fritz basically put some new text on top of that diploma, Xeroxes it, submits it with his job application. Looks like he has a degree in Egyptology when he never did. Clearly, obviously, the Gospel of Jesus' wife isn't a Xerox job, but it also uses the same cut and paste sort of MO, where nothing is original. It's all, to use a term that comes up in the Gospel of Thomas, it's all an image of an image. Yes. And I think that all of that makes, so the point here is that Walter Fritz can swear up and down that he didn't forge the Gospel of Jesus' wife. What Walter Fritz can no longer do is claim that he is not a forger, or that he works very closely with forgers, or frankly, that he's not willing to risk criminal charges via forgery, because submitting fake education credentials in the state of Florida with the intent to defraud is a crime. He never was detected. But I think one of the breakthroughs for me in the reporting of the book is this discovery that Walter Fritz is indeed a creator of or condoner of forgeries, of known forgeries, and is willing to risk quite a bit of his own skin in sort of sending them into the world.
Yeah, really fascinating. And at the same time, getting psychological. Again, I want to say on the record, I feel no schadenfreude or excitement about Karen King or Walter Fritz, because you're a journalist. Of course, you're putting out all the data, all the facts out there. But you also show a picture that, to me, bring a lot of empathy to both Karen King and Walter Fritz. I mean, Walter Fritz had his own unconscious desires, his own blind spots. And as you write, much of it was because he had not a very good childhood. He was apparently raped by a priest. He came from a broken home. At the time of the Gospel of Jesus' wife, his life was kind of falling apart. His porn business was losing money. He couldn't sell his house, his company he'd lost. So there was a lot going on that made Walter Fritz do what he did. And as you write, Ariel, he was settling scores with all the male authority figures who robbed him of his potential. In essence, he didn't have a father or other figures. And again, it's almost like destiny that he would do this and meet Karen King.